working with task duration, constraints, and deadlines. Whenever you create a task, you have to set the duration for the task, or how long it will take to complete. However, before you enter a duration for the task, you must know the 3 task types. These types will have an effect on how project schedules the work of the task. The 3 task types in Project 2013 are fixed duration. Fixed duration tasks take a set amount of time to complete, no matter how many resources there are for the task. Fixed units. These are the default task type. When you use this type, you assign resources to a task with a certain number of units or hours of work expressed as a percentage of the working day. The resources assignments do not change, even if you would change the duration of the task or the work amount. Fixed work. This is where the number of resource hours assigned to a task affects its duration. Don't worry about resources at this point. We'll cover these in just a few lessons. To set a task type, double-click on the task to see the task information dialog box. Click on the Advanced tab. Now you can select the task type in the task type field. Setting a duration for a task means setting the amount of time that it will take a task to complete. With all task information that you enter, you need to be in the Gantt chart view. Double-click on the task name to see the task information dialog box. If your task has subtasks, you need to click on each subtask and enter the duration of those. Project will then determine a total duration. Use the arrow keys to increase or decrease the duration. The measurement displayed by default is days. If you need to change the measure, enter M for minutes, H for hours, W for weeks, and MO for months. Click OK when you're done. To set a recurring tasks or tasks that appear over and over again at regular intervals, go to the Task tab, then click on the Task button, and then click Recurring Task. You'll then see this dialog box. Enter a name for the task and then select the recurrence pattern. Next, enter the range or dates that it will recur between. When you set a start and finish date for the task, it applies a constraint that it can override any dependency, which we'll learn about later, or any other timing factors. We'll learn more about constraints later as well, but for now, it is easy to learn how to set a start and finish date. To set a start date, double-click on the task name. In the Task Information dialog box, click on the General tab. In the Dates section, select the start and finish dates, and then click OK. A short while ago, we learnt how to set duration. In the Task Information dialog box, you can see the estimated checkbox to the right of where you set the task duration. When it is checked, a question mark appears over your duration. You can check this box when you're unsure how long a task will take and want to let people know about your uncertainty, or if you need a way to enter exact timing when you have more information. Once you've checked the estimated box, you need to apply a filter that will apply to all tasks with estimated durations. Let's click OK. And now let's have a look how we can apply a filter. To apply a filter, select the duration column in your task list by clicking the duration heading once, and clicking on the down arrow to the right of it. All filters are selected by default. To see just the tasks that have estimated durations, only check the box with question marks that follow the durations. Then click OK. To go back to the way it was set, click on the same button, and click on the Select All button to make sure all durations are selected, and then click OK. Of course, when you have a project, you're going to need project to be completed by a certain date. With that, you'll have definitions for tasks so that each aspect of the project runs smoothly and on time. In Project, a deadline is a date that you can assign to a task that does not constrain the task timing. When you assign a deadline date to a task, and the task runs past the deadline, Project displays an indicator symbol by the task itself. To someone that's never used Project before, this may seem a bit confusing, especially since we haven't even discussed constraints thus far. The good news is that we're going to devote the next section of this lesson to learning about constraints. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and show you how to set a deadline for the task because it is so easy to do. To set a deadline date, double-click on the task to make the Task Information dialog box appear. Click on the Advanced tab. Click on the arrow in the deadline field. A calendar will appear. Select your deadline date, and click OK to save the setting. A little downward arrow will appear in the deadline date on the graph, as you can see here. You may also see an icon in the indicators column if you've set a duration. To modify a deadline, follow the steps we just did and change the date. It's that easy. Now let's move on to constraints. In our day-to-day lives, constraints are something we have to live with. A good example of this would be budget constraints that prohibit us from shopping as much as we'd like. In project, constraints really are not much different, so don't be afraid of them. We haven't put off discussing them because they're that complicated. Instead, we just wanted to wait and introduce you to them at the proper time, when perhaps everything else about tasks no longer seems so daunting and confusing. That said, in project, a constraint is simply a timing condition that controls a task. You already know that a task start and finish times control the duration of a task and determine its timing. A constraint comes into play when the project starts to run late. An example is when you set a constraint that a task must finish by a certain date. Microsoft Project will shift around almost any other task in the schedule to recalculate timing before it will suggest that a particular task might finish on another date. In other words, putting a constraint on a task means that everything else scheduled for your project might be shifted so the project can meet the constraint that you set. Because of this, you should only use constraints if there's no other option and you absolutely need to. Before we teach you how to apply constraints, let's look at all the possible constraints that you can put on a task and the effects it will have on a task timing. As soon as possible, this is a default constraint. The task will start as early as possible in the schedule based on dependencies and the project start date. As late as possible. This means the task will start as late as possible based on dependencies and the project's finish date. Finish no earlier than. The end of the task cannot take place any earlier than the date that you specify. Finish no later than. The end of the task cannot take place any later than the date you specify. Must finish on. The task must finish by a specified date. Must start on. The task must start on a specified date. Start no earlier than. The task cannot start any earlier than the specified date. And start no later than means the task cannot start any later than the specified date. Only one constraint can be placed on a task. You will use the task information dialog box to set any constraints that you want. Let's walk through and set our first constraint together. Before we do, let's take a look at our task list and graph as it exists now. This way, you can easily note changes that constraints will make. This may make it easier to understand, but it will definitely make navigating the workspace easier for you. Here's the original task list and graph. To start, we double-click on the task that we want to apply a constraint to so that the task information dialog box appears. You may need to enter a duration and some dates for this to work. To start with, we double-click on the task that we want to apply a constraint to so that the task information dialog box appears. Click on the Advanced tab. We're going to work with the constraint type drop-down. If this appears grayed out, it could be because some of the fields are not editable because the task is manually scheduled. Click on Cancel, right-click on the task, and then click on Auto Schedule. Now, double-click on the task again. In the Constraint Type field, select the type of constraint that you want to apply. We're going to change the default constraint and instead select Finish no earlier than. This means we have to select a date. Click OK to save the settings. In the Gantt chart view, we now see the constraint noted for the task. The start and finish dates are highlighted and there's a calendar icon in the indicators column. In a graph, a taskbar appears on the earliest finish date we've specified for the constraint. Critical tasks, also known as a critical path, are a series of tasks that must occur on time if your project is to meet its deadline. What you have to decide is how many tasks in your project are on the critical path and how many can be given some slack. There's not a formula or software program that can decide this for you, unfortunately. It is something you're going to need to figure out each time you run a new project. Here are some identifiers that help you locate critical tasks. Tasks that are critical to the completion of the project. Tasks that are time-consuming and are maybe reliant on outside forces or perfect conditions. An example is having electricity installed in a new building. All types of problems can arise. You need electricity and you need to have the new building ready for occupancy by the deadline, but there's a chance it could take longer. Although you do not have time within the project for it to take longer, it very possibly could. Tasks that are critical to the project, but of which you aren't sure of the actual duration. Since any critical tasks that you have in your project can push you past the deadline if they're not completed, you have to figure out which ones are not critical so that you can add some slack into those. That way, if critical tasks need additional time, you can use the slack from the other tasks without going past the deadline. This can be very important if you have a boss waiting for you to complete the project and relying on you to complete it on time. That said, some tasks already have slack built into them because they occur during the duration of a longer task, so they share a dependency. You can delay the shorter task until the longer task gets closer to finishing. Here's how you could build some slack into non-critical tasks to accommodate critical tasks and still meet your deadline. The first thing you can do is extend the duration of all tasks. Inflate them by 2 days or figure out the risk of delay with each task and pad them accordingly. The problem with this arises when changes occur. You may have to adjust durations on several tasks to accommodate a schedule that's running ahead or behind. The better idea is building slack tasks into your project or even into each phase of your project. Slack tasks could be simple tasks like approving proofs. This is a task that won't take but a few minutes, but you can build time into a project by creating this task. That way, if a critical task needs more time to complete, you have the extra time created by the slack task that you can use. However, if your project won't allow you to add slack tasks because there's not a minute to spare, there's also something else you can do. Check your dependencies. There may be some tasks that you have scheduled to start at the end of a predecessor task. Some of these tasks might be able to start during or even with the predecessor task. This will also help you build in some time to eliminate critical tasks or critical path.